Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll continue our retrospective of the major news stories of 2025 from the Background Briefing archives, and go to an interview on July the 20th of 2025, when many were fretting over whether we might be in a constitutional crisis when we were already there. We examined whether we are past that and already in a Trump dictatorship and should be working on how to get the Constitution back and restore our democracy. Joining us was Sean Wilentz, the George Henry Davis 1886 Professor of American History at Princeton University. His books include The Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Lincoln, The Age of Reagan, A History, 1974 to 2008, Bob Dylan in America, and The Politicians and the Egalitarians. His latest book is No Property in Man, Slavery and Anti-Slavery at the Nation's Founding, and he's the co-host of the podcast, The Court of History. Then we will go to an interview from September the 28th of 2025, when our guest was on a boat with a flotilla trying to deliver aid to Gaza. Joining us was David Adler, General Coordinator of the Progressive International, who previously served as a foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders in his campaign for U.S. President, Policy Director of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025, and the co-founder of its Green New Deal for Europe campaign. He was on a boat with a flotilla heading for Gaza that already had been under attack by Israeli drones, dropping explosive and incendiary devices as well as chemical agents. And David had an article at The Guardian, "We are sailing to Gaza, here's why." Then finally, we go to an interview from October the 1st of 2025 on a frightening move that went under the radar by Trump and Stephen Miller to outlaw and defund political opposition as anti-Christian and anti-American in the name of dismantling left-wing terrorism, which means going after over half of the country's common beliefs that don't align with Stephen Miller's extreme political paranoia and delusion. Joining us was Ken Klippenstein, an independent journalist reporting on the United States national security, state, and politics. He previously was an investigative reporter at The Intercept, and prior to that was the D.C. correspondent at The Nation and a senior reporter for The Young Turks. He now publishes a popular Substack at kenklippenstein.com, where he had a recent article we discussed. Trump's NSPM 7 labels common beliefs as terrorist indicators. And before we begin, as this year ends and you can make tax-deductible donations for 2025, I'm hoping you consider backgroundbriefing.org/donate and publictruthmedia.org for your charitable giving, since we produce a daily news analysis program covering the major stories in the news 5 days a week on a very modest budget, and have recently expanded our production team from 2 people, that's me and Graham, to 5 employees as we expand our social media presence and have a new Gen Z reporter to engage the future generation in a coalition of boomers and zoomers out to make America decent and sane again, and the world a better place for all. So happy holidays to you, and the very best in the new year as we expand our fact-based community in post-truth America. And joining us now, Sean Wilentz, who's the George Henry Davis 1886 Professor of American History at Princeton University, whose books include The Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Lincoln, The Age of Reagan, A History, 1974 to 2008, Bob Dylan in America, and The Politicians and the Egalitarians. His latest book is No Property in Man, Slavery and Anti-Slavery at the Nation's Founding, and he's the co-host of the podcast, The Court of History. Welcome to Background Briefing, Sean Wilentz.
Wonderful to be here again, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And of course, the country's going to hell. Many keep talking about we're in a constitutional crisis. And I take it you think we're beyond a constitutional crisis. We're going to have to start thinking about how to recapture our democracy and our Constitution, for that matter.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, some time ago, I thought that the idea of our being in a crisis was obsolete, that we'd gone beyond that into a state of, actually what my colleague out at Stanford, out in California, Stanford, Jack Rakov, wrote an excellent piece, I believe it was in the Washington Monthly, explaining why what had been a constitutional crisis had become a matter of constitutional failure, that the Constitution had failed to provide kinds of protections against the kind of tyranny that we're seeing evolve right now. And I think that Jack was right then. And I think that once the Constitution has failed, then we're in a state of what? We've lost it. For the moment, at any rate, we are not living under the Constitution of the United States. We're living under something different. You can see this in a number of different ways. Not only the obvious lawlessness of a president ruling in effect by emergency decree, his emergency decrees being augmented by cases being approved by the Supreme Court on a so-called shadow docket, in which they can make all sorts of decisions favorable to the administration, or to the regime, rather, the Trump regime, without having to explain anything, without having to say anything about why, the reasoning behind what they're doing. You can get dissents from them, but they will just put it right through. You see it in a number of other ways. You see it, for example, in the recent bill. I don't want to call it the big, beautiful bill. I can call it the big, beautiful, or the unbig barnyard expletive bill. In any number of ways, but the most alarming being the amount of money that was funneled to ICE. ICE is now become the largest police entity in the United States, apart from the U.S. military, under the command of the White House, which is to say, under the command of Stephen Miller. The bill gave them a $200 billion appropriation. This is extraordinary. These are guys who are recently hired, many of them, I presume, insurgents from January 6th. This is, in effect, a private army, which on my podcast, which you very nicely mentioned, Ian, recently had the very important scholar Theda Skocpol on, and she made very clear that this looked like the very first step towards creating a police state. That's where we are. Let's just face the facts and see it for what it is. Can it be undone? I hope so, but it can't be undone if we think things are just kind of normal and fine, because the ramifications of all of what I just said, in terms of the electoral process itself, are enormous. And I think that unless we come to terms with where we are, the seriousness of where we are, we won't be able to understand how to take it back.
So you mentioned, Sean, the Supreme Court. That seems to be the first item of business in terms of taking the scales off our eyes and stop pretending that the court is an arbiter of justice, and particularly the Chief Justice John Roberts calling balls and strikes.
Yes,
I mean, if you look at go back to Bush v. Gore in the 2000 election, 3 of those current far-right justices showed up there, not just John Roberts working to overturn the vote, which would have been awarded had they continued counting, would have been awarded to Al Gore, but it wasn't just Roberts; it was Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett. So it seems to me that the only explanation for why they are giving Trump everything and anything he wants, and they seem to be oblivious about who Trump is and what he's doing, is because I think they want a situation like you have in Putin's Russia, where you have one-party rule, you have the patina of democracy, the illusion of democracy with opposition parties, but at the end of the day, then the only one party will ever get elected. I mean, we are heading into one-party rule. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, I think that's certainly the logic of where we're headed. There's certainly, if you follow up what's been going on, beginning, I mean, yes, we can actually go back to 2000 to Bush v. Gore, to be sure, but it's really accelerated in recent years and was sort of capped off by the immunity decision back on July 1st, 2024, which was, in my view, the most shocking decision that any Supreme Court had handed down since Dred Scott. And in some ways even more shocking than Dred Scott. but it opened up the way for this president to be able to undertake, and they knew who they were, who was going to be for, to undertake the kinds of tyrannical rule that he is doing now, because he is immune from any kind of criminal prosecution for anything that is considered an official act. If you just think about that for a second, what the ramifications of that are. I mean, literally, his own lawyer said that he could send out a Navy SEAL team to assassinate a political foe, but if that was an official act, he would not be liable. Extraordinary, right?
Right.
This was a decision that liberated a president to be able to murder fellow citizens if he deemed them political enemies. Now, where does that all lead to? Well, let me back up a sec. I mean, I think a lot of Americans of very goodwill who don't like what's going on, who hate what's going on, have nevertheless thought that, well, of all the branches of the government, with the House and the Senate basically in Trump's pocket, right? The legislature is not going to do much. There are the states, which you should not rule out. They will do their best, but I'll get back to the states in a second. But then there's the courts. And the courts would be a brake, a guardrail, if you will, on Trump's excesses. And indeed, the courts have stood up and in many ways tried to block many of the executive orders that he began signing the day he was inaugurated on January 20th. On all sorts of things, most importantly on birthright citizenship, or the most notably on for birthright citizenship. You had federal courts shutting down basically those orders on the basis they were unconstitutional, which in the case of birthright citizens birthright citizenship is basically patent. It's patently unconstitutional. Their recent decision basically vacating the possibility that any federal court can place down an injunction, put down an injunction against a patently unconstitutional action by the president. Well, there we are. I mean, they're opening the way for not just the non-enforcement, not only for the enforcement of a patently unconstitutional action, right? But basically paving the way, I believe, for the removal of birthright citizenship, or the gross modification of birthright citizenship, so that it will have no effect whatsoever. Going back, in fact, to Bush v. Gore, meaning the final completion of the effective annulment of the 14th Amendment. This is shocking, but there we are. So you can depend on the lower courts to do all kinds of things, and many, outstanding judges, outstanding judges in favor of American democracy have been doing that, despite their own harassment. The death threats that have been coming to federal judges ruling on these things have skyrocketed over the last 2 or 3 years, which of course Chief Justice Roberts, who is their boss, has done nothing to protect his own people. They are the stalwarts of American democracy, but they're going to be overruled, I fear, at every turn by the Supreme Court. That the Supreme Court really has the last say on these things, so that you effectively have a trifecta tyranny between the White House, the Congress, and the court.
So in terms of checks and balances, we've lost the judiciary. We've also lost the legislative branch because of the Republicans' fealty to Trump. And they've just thrown away with this rescission of $9 billion, which cuts funds for NPR and PBS and foreign aid.
Right.
In doing so, they have given up the real power of the House, which is the power of the purse strings.
Correct.
Unbelievable what's happening. Again,
Right. Well, that's why I say the Constitution doesn't, we are not living under the Constitution of the United States as written and as ratified. We are living in another world, in part because of the slavish devotion to Trump that the House of Representatives and the Senate, for that matter, has shown. Trump has shown that he can do that with threats both political and physical. Once you do that, once you have thrown off, as you say, the power of the purse, which is the most sacred power, in effect, secular sacred power that the House has, very clearly spelled out at every level in the Constitution. And if you go back to the original debates, where it's exactly what they wanted to do, that's been abrogated. It is truly astonishing. But until we understand that's what's happened, we're going to be living in a dream world. Yeah.
Sean, we've run out of time, but I
Ah,
really appreciate you joining us here today. As much as
anytime, Ian, it's always
depresses
wonderful to talk to you.
as much as it depresses the hell out of me,
Yeah,
it's
well, there it is. Look,
you're keeping it real,
the
okay?
key, the key to getting anywhere is to know where you are. And I think we have to do that.
Well, thank you. And again, I've been speaking with Sean Wilentz, who's a George Henry Davis 1886 professor of American history at Princeton University, whose books include The Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Lincoln, The Age of Reagan, A History, 1974 to 2008, Bob Dylan in America, and The Politicians and the Egalitarians. And his latest book is No Property in Man, Slavery and Anti-Slavery, the Nation's Founding. And he's the co-host of the podcast, The Court of History. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back in a moment with an interview from September the 28th of 2025 with David Adler.
Make America great again. Back to the time we remember when everybody had a white picket fence. We gotta make America great again. Take us back to the good old days when men relied on a team of slaves. All the while you tell them Jesus saves. We gotta make America great again.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is David Adler, General Coordinator of the Progressive International, who previously served as a foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders in his campaign for the U.S. presidency. He's policy director of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025 and the co-founder of its Green New Deal for Europe campaign. And he is on a boat with a flotilla heading for Gaza that has already been under attack by Israeli drones. And he has an article at The Guardian, We Are Sailing to Gaza, Here's Why. Welcome to Background Briefing, David Adler.
Thanks for having me back, Ian. It's a pleasure.
Of course, we're playing this interview or broadcasting it on Sunday, and we're recording it on Friday because for the next few days you'll be out of communication. So where will you be, David, on Sunday, assuming that you arrive at your destination?
It's already been quite an odyssey, I must say. So embarking from Barcelona, picking up the so-called Maghreb fleet in Tunisia, where we suffered 2 successive drone attacks on our boats, onwards to Sicily, and now into the territorial waters of Greece, just outside of which we suffered again a heavy bombardment that I'm sure we'll talk about from a swarm of drones in the middle of the night. So it's taken us quite a bit longer than the original plans for this global Sumud flotilla, which brings together delegations from over 40 countries around the world and the largest convoy in history to traverse the Mediterranean Sea to break the siege and deliver humanitarian aid. And along the way, we picked up some friends and enemies. I'm sure we'll discuss the kind of architecture of the geopolitics of this initiative, but I can say right now I'm gazing across a very quiet and dark Mediterranean, and it's quite beautiful with seeing all the boats united together in one convoy, preparing for the final leg, the most perilous part of this process, which is our final approach to Gaza.
And you're on the boat called the Family or Family, and you've already been under attack. So describe these drone attacks. They come in the night. I guess you can hear them, and what are they dropping? Bombs? I mean, it's got to be dangerous, isn't it?
I'll make a distinction between the 2 sets of drone attacks on this particular mission. The first came in the port of Sidi Bou Said in Tunis, which was, of course, not only attack on our flotilla, was an attack on a sovereign nation of Tunisia, just hundreds of meters away from the presidential palace. In fact, an extremely scandalous act of terror. Of course, on the same day that the state of Israel was bombing Doha and southern Lebanon, the level of rogue behavior has become so normalized we forget what it means for these attacks to take place under any interpretation of international law. In those instances, between midnight and 1 a.m., drones approached the 2 principal vessels of the fleet and deployed incendiary devices that blew up in flames on the deck. We were with crews on board. We were very lucky in both instances that there were no serious injuries, and that the crews were trained up enough to evacuate from the front of the boats to retrieve appropriate saltwater hoses to try to put out the flames. What was amazing, Ian, in response to those first attacks, before I get to the second ones, because I think it's important to think about how this convoy moves along and how it is succeeding to accelerate and to amplify geopolitical response to the horrors of Gaza. So at the beginning of that, in the first 20 minutes that followed this drone attack, the Tunisian authorities came out and said this must have been some technical failure or a cigarette butt that lit up this boat. But when the CCTV was revealed, they finally backtracked and told the true story and called it a premeditated attack on the flotilla. Now, that was scandalous, but it was nothing compared to the attack that we suffered off the territorial waters of Greece, where between the hours of 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., a swarm of lethal drones came and attacked 14 separate boats with a mixture of explosive devices, incendiary devices, chemical substances, which of course for our crews who are just, ordinary citizens and people motivated by a humanitarian conviction, very difficult to tell. We don't have like kits to find out what these chemicals are on board. And of course, we're not inviting formal investigation because we're extremely concerned about bureaucratic sabotage, getting drawn in by any one of these countries that could slow down or prevent our mission from unfolding, which has happened in the past. But the response to that was completely different. We saw the Italians mobilized by their literal millions to block ports, to block highways, to block schools and streets, forcing the hand of the Meloni government to deploy not just one, but two large-scale warships to help protect the flotilla. There's an irony there. And then yesterday at the United Nations, or if this is playing on Sunday, on Thursday at the United Nations, I believe Pedro Sanchez, president of Spain, announced that he would also be deploying from Cartagena a maritime vessel to protect the lives of Spanish citizens and the humanitarian mission more broadly of the global Sumud flotilla.
So aboard this global Sumud flotilla, you're on the lead ship, Family. There are, 40 national delegations, and aboard your ship or your boat, you've got the former mayor of Barcelona, who's the mother of 2 young children. You've got Bianca Webb-Pullman, a practicing family doctor from Australia. And you've also got Adele Hanel, who's a French actress who beat you at chess. So give us a flavor of what life's aboard this flotilla as you're heading into more and more danger. I mean, what you've gone through now is pretty dangerous, and I imagine the Israelis are going to up the ante.
So I'd say there's 3 main aspects to life on these boats. The first aspect is very quotidian, and it's doing boat things. It's cleaning toilets, it's sweeping the deck, it's preparing breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's life on a boat. I mean, we are simply a set of humanitarian vessels, small boats and large boats, motor cruisers and sailboats who are crossing the Mediterranean, carrying acting with humanitarian aid. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect of life on the boat is operational and strategic. We have a huge fleet. It's larger than the combination of all previous attempts by the Freedom Flotilla Coalition to reach Gaza with humanitarian aid. So there's a huge amount of logistics that go into this. There's broken motors, there's lots of logistical problems, there's how to cruise through international waters in ways that both avoid risks to our south, such as the Libyan Coast Guard, which we're very afraid of confronting, as well as to our north, such as the Greek Coast Guard, which we also were very afraid of confronting, both of which are very beholden to both the United States and Israel. So a second aspect is highly logistical, and we're all involved in managing those logistics. And the third aspect is diplomatic. So the goal of this mission is not just to drop aid in Gaza and then go home and feel proud of ourselves. The goal is to be a lightning for a more sustained, greater scale mobilization that we're seeing erupt all over the world. I mean, hugely in Europe, which is very well represented on these boats. Maybe your listeners in Los Angeles don't feel this as much in terms of the mobilization, but this flotilla is attracting a lot of attention, and it's feeding in a very virtuous cycle to a lot of the mobilizations that are happening in the streets of Madrid and Milan, as well as in Kuala Lumpur and Sao Paulo, all across the world, with all the people who are represented on the flotilla. So we want to make the most of this journey as we traverse the Mediterranean, as we across this great sea, a sea that Gaza shares, to try to denormalize a bit the structure of violence that Israel has installed and kind of made us all numb to. I think people around the world forget that the siege of Gaza is fundamentally illegal. It's not acceptable for Israel, under any interpretation of international law, to decide what reaches Gaza's shores and doesn't. I mean, it's sort of unfathomable. Imagine Californians being told that, another power will decide what can reach Santa Monica or not. It's crazy to imagine, especially when we're so obviously carrying humanitarian aid, as was declared and protected by the 16 states that have now come forward to protect diplomatically this mission. So a big task that I have as the co-general coordinator of the Progressive International, part of my job is to help sustain and support that diplomatic coordination, to activate the parliamentarians and the prime ministers and the presidents to our cause. And above all, this is the most critical point, to emphasize that it should not be ordinary people who are taking humanitarian matters into our own hands. And sure, we're willing to shoulder this burden and put our lives on the line, because it pales in comparison to the risks endured by Palestinians every single day across the occupied territories. But that it's the states themselves. We don't want protection for our flotilla. We want states to join our mission. We're happy to open this corridor, but it should be the states themselves standing behind us and sending in boats with the amount of humanitarian aid that corresponds to the severity and the urgency of the genocide of Gaza.
But a few years ago, a Turkish vessel, the Mavi Marmara, was boarded by Israeli commandos, and 9 activists were killed, and the 10th died from injuries. So when I said earlier, and we're talking on Friday, and by the way, today, Friday, at the United Nations, Netanyahu made his speech. There was a huge walkout of delegates who walked out on his speech. He said that they're going to finish the job in Gaza. Apparently, the speech was broadcast into Gaza by loudspeakers for whatever reasons. I don't quite know. He said that the two-state solution is sheer madness. It's insane, and we won't do it. And essentially, the only reasonable thing that came out of this is apparently that Trump said that he won't support the annexation of the West Bank. Trump says it's not going to happen. So that's the news here today, Friday, that we're recording this interview with you, because as of in the next few hours, you're going to be out of communication range as you get closer to Gaza and into more and more danger. So it did feel, just looking at Netanyahu at the UN, that he's both defiant and defensive. So what are you hoping to achieve in terms, and you and your colleagues taking these risks to take humanitarian aid to Gaza?
Well, I think that the United Nations this week has really one-upped itself in the great circus of state recognition of Palestine. That was a great gesture of people like Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer patted themselves on the back for recognizing this highly Bantu state of Palestine, while its people are being exterminated and their communities destroyed and their land annexed. So we're trying to draw attention away from this high diplomatic theater, this speeches, declarations, and condemnations, back towards the narrow facts of the situation in Gaza, which is that millions of people have their lives menaced by the so-called Israeli Defense Forces at this very moment, that are bombarding and destroying Gaza City in their ongoing incursion, that tanks are rolling into Ramallah as we speak in the occupied territories of the West Bank. I think that there's a certain pyrotechnic aspect of the General Assembly that we are trying to contrast with, of course, this very humble humanitarian, initiative of ordinary people who are traveling on these second-hand vessels. But we're trying to also at the same time push back against the sense of desolation, desperation, and disillusionment, I think, that millions of people around the world feel, who have been scrolling through images of slaughter and massacres for 2 years now, feeling hopeless and impotent, and remind them that there is something that they can do, that there are ways of acting directly to, even if they involve a degree of risk, to push more on the defensive aspects which you mentioned, and therefore reveal more of Netanyahu's true intentions, which is to behave in this way. So I think, on this mission, we're really trying to align ourselves with a rich tradition of pacifist and nonviolent resistance that is ranges from Nelson Mandela and Rosa Parks to Gandhi and beyond. I mean, we are a group of ordinary people. Really, I can't even express kind of how beautiful it is to see everyone in their diversity and plurality who've come many of them continents away, spending the last cents of their savings accounts to be a part of this mission. And no one is afraid. I mean, it's important, Ian, to emphasize, after each one of these attacks, we have these meetings, these general assemblies, and they ask us, are we sailing to Gaza? And every time we say, yes, we are. We must face down these horrors. We must raise the stakes. We must force our states to action if they will not do so themselves on their own.
So just in the last couple of minutes, David, Netanyahu, of course, says that those states, as you say, they may feel virtuous about the recognition of Palestine and the calling for a two-state solution, but clearly that more needs to be done to really make it effective, and that would be, of course, an arms embargo. But Netanyahu's response, even to these states like Australia, the UK, France, and Canada, and Portugal, has been, that basically, and I'm sure it's the same way that he'll characterize you and your colleagues aboard the Flotilla, that you're basically dupes of Hamas at best and anti-Semites at worst. And of course, it's a little bit hard to take in your case because you come from a Jewish family here in Los Angeles, and I can vouch for the fact that because I know your parents.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, for the vouch. But no, I think Israel has Netanyahu has had to make a very difficult decision in confronting our initiative. Either we are, as he has said about the previous flotilla missions this year, just a pleasure crew who's a selfie yacht and indulgence for celebrity activists, or we are, as they've described us in this case, a Hamas flotilla. We represent some imminent, horrible risk to the national security of Israel. And it does risk bordering on the absurd, not only because I'm surrounded by, people playing guitar and singing Bob Dylan, but also because, they're trying to smear us as anti-Semites. And I'm here holding on to my Jewish identity, thinking, dear God, I mean, if we don't, as Jews, mobilize now to rescue our identity from these maniacs who are trying to pervert and distort it for their agenda of ethnic cleansing and terror, I mean, it will be too late to recover a sense of Judaism from the ruins of Gaza.
So just in closing then, we're talking on Friday, you're heading to Gaza, that you've already been under drone attacks, which are likely to escalate. Again, we're broadcasting on Sunday, so we don't quite know your fate.
Come on, let's be a bit optimistic here, Ian. No, we don't know. We're planning for lots of different scenarios, and of course it's being broadcast on Sunday. But in all likelihood, we're entering a hot zone, not just for sort of Israeli activity and retaliation, but also of complicity. So I mentioned before that the Italian government has deployed these warships. I don't want to celebrate the government of Giorgia Meloni, neo-fascists as they are, for doing this, because what it actually is, and they've come out and said it themselves openly, Meloni has slandered and defamed our initiative as being somehow vainglorious and effective, and actually revealed that this scheme is only designed to force the Italians aboard and the rest of the flotilla to hand over the aid that we have to these warships in a scheme that they're coordinating with the Cypriot government and the Israeli government. So we're being kind of encircled. It's not just that we're sailing to Gaza, it's that we have these warships up the rear and we're moving into sort of Cypriot, near Cypriot waters. Cyprus, of course, being a hotbed of Israeli logistics for and air bases for managing a lot of the refueling and intelligence around the Gaza genocide. So everything is going to get very hot, and there's too many question marks, which is why we're preparing for every potential scenario. We do drills for drones, we have night watches, we do drills for interception, light and violent interceptions. We're prepared to handle what comes our way. I think what is troubling, and here I want to sort of make a plea or a message to your listeners, is that in many cases, I think U.S. Americans tend to believe that our passports are golden somehow, that they protect us, that if we're in trouble in Guatemala or in Shanghai, somehow the U.S. Embassy will come and save us. What makes this mission so dispiriting, but also so determined, fills us with such determination, is knowing that the Trump administration would truly rather see us rot in an Israeli dungeon than come to our aid. So while many countries will have diplomatic envoys, should we be intercepted, sort of help them or at least give them sort of a moral boost, we're completely on our own here. And that's where we're going to rely on normal people, on our elected representatives, on our allies of conscience across the United States to basically say, look, these are our fellow citizens, our compatriots who did the right thing when our government was doing the wrong thing, and we'll demand their release. And we really are relying on a social mobilization, all of us across the world, but in particular in the United States, to defend our lives before we are attacked in a preemptive sense. But even if we were to be violently intercepted, to stand up for us in incarceration.
Well, David Adler, I thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you very much.
And again, I've been speaking with David Adler, who's the General Coordinator of the Progressive International, who previously served as a foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders in his campaign for the U.S. presidency. He's policy director of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025 and the co-founder of its Green New Deal for Europe campaign. And he's on a boat with a flotilla heading for Gaza that has already been under attack by Israeli drones. And he has an article at The Guardian, "We are sailing to Gaza. Here's why." We're going to take a brief station break. We're back in a moment with an interview from October the 1st of 2025 with Ken Klippenstein.
Horror grips us as we watch you die. All we can do is echo your anguished cries. Stare as all human feelings die. We are leaving. You don't need us.
And joining us now is Ken Klippenstein, who is an independent journalist covering national security and U.S. politics, who worked at The Intercept. Prior to joining The Intercept, Klippenstein was the D.C. correspondent at The Nation and previously was a senior investigative reporter for the online news program The Young Turks. He now publishes the popular Substack at kenklippenstein.com, where he has a recent article, "Trump's NSPM 7 labels common beliefs as terrorism indicators." Welcome to Background Briefing, Ken Klippenstein.
Hi, Ian. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us, Ken. And your article is incredibly important. And it seems, as you've written subsequently, that it's alarmed law firms while the Congress is silent. But on last Thursday, Trump released this national security directive called National Security Presidential Memorandum 7. And it's not an executive order. It's far more significant because if you go back in history, for example, President Truman's NSC 68 was the foundation of U.S. Cold War strategy. So these directives can be so much more important, lasting, and significant than executive orders. So how would you describe it, Ken?
Yeah, so this came a couple of days after the designation of Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization, which was I think, less significant move than this one. And maybe that's why it got overlooked. Obviously, there's a bunch of other stuff going on, but this is really a sweeping strategy document that kind of tells the executive branch agencies from the FBI to, whatever law enforcement agency you want to think of, that they need to focus their counterterrorism efforts not on their traditional targets, foreign terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but within. And this was a message that you saw reiterated by President Trump in Quantico, Virginia, in his meeting with all these top generals from the Pentagon, saying the enemy is within. And that's a pretty good way, I think, of summarizing what it is that this presidential memorandum does. So what it does is that once you target terrorism, there's a approach to counterterrorism that is unique to the CT approach and is distinct from ordinary crime fighting. Typically, the way that you respond to crime is you find one that's been committed, you gather evidence to make your case that, whoever it is you think committed it did so, and then you charge them with whatever crime you've pulled together evidence that they've broken. In the case of counterterrorism, you are trying to preempt crime. And so it's sort of like a practice of pre-crime, which in cases of like 9/11 or chemical attack or maybe a WMD attack, one can imagine situations in which there's a more compelling case for getting in the business of pre-crime because it's so off. The potential crisis is so awful that it's worth trying to stop it from happening in the first place. But what this memorandum does, and it goes out of its way to say specifically, stop violent acts before they have happened. You have to. What is the predicate then to try to prevent a crime since one hasn't been committed? Well, you've got to find what are called indicators, and this memorandum lists a bunch of indicators. And I was struck by how many Americans these indicators would describe. There were things like anti-capitalism rhetoric, anti-Christian rhetoric, anti-American, whatever that means. And so, this is way broader than what we have seen in the past in regards to, fighting terrorism, counterterrorism approaches. And what's interesting about it is there doesn't need to be a new agency created or a new law. I think there's a lot of confusion about the fact that there's no law for designating a domestic terrorist organization. That doesn't mean that these agencies can't treat things as terrorism. It just means you can't charge them with terrorism in a court of law. And it also doesn't mean that there aren't resources that the federal government can use to investigate these cases of what they consider to be terrorism. And in this case, the memorandum authorizes what are called joint terrorism task forces, of which there's one in all 50 states established after the 9/11 attacks to try to respond to the next 9/11. And so this represents thousands of law enforcement agents, local and federal, including FBI agents that have now, through this memorandum, been told to look for all those indicators that I was just describing before. So this is a really sweeping and big picture change. And I've been kind of shocked at how little attention in the mainstream press there's been.
And you mentioned these indicators, anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the U.S. government. That's, I think, long-standing. Extremism on migration, extremism on race, extremism on gender, hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on religion, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on morality. So this goes beyond pre-crime, as in the movie Minority Report. This is a sort of moral authoritarianism, almost a jihad, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, how do you define these things? And moreover, that's got to describe millions and millions and millions. I mean, this is the fabric of America. There are people who are not Christian. I'm Christian myself, but I don't have any problem with someone not being Christian. And indeed, that's like half the country. So I was just struck by how ambitious and far-reaching this order is. And that's just the counterterrorism. So that's only part of it. It also directs the Treasury Department to start looking at nonprofit orgs that they deem to be, aiding and abetting or in support of these forms of terrorism that I described before. And, it calls it radical left. But I went and looked at some of the major law firms in Washington, which are advising clients on this. And they are already telling clients in the nonprofit space, including, quote, progressive clients, not necessarily like, radical far left groups in the language of the Trump administration. They're telling them, hey, you guys better start paying attention to this because it could be applied to you. And the effect that is going to have, completely aside from the counterterrorism investigations, is to chill speech generally. I mean, I've worked at these nonprofits. They will look at this and say, oh gosh, maybe we're going to do something that might draw the ire of the administration. Maybe we should proceed with a little bit more caution and maybe not pursue this project. So it's already having effects on speech. There are already law firms saying that they're advising clients to be careful about what they say as a result of this.
Right, but if they can say, which they do often, that George Soros funds terrorism, then the definition is completely elastic. And it seems to me that the real strategy here is, and a lot of it's in Project 2025, particularly, say, for example, their education strategy. Vice President Vance has made it clear that they're going after the universities, and particularly the Ivy Leagues, because they want to basically, end what they call liberal education and bring in more MAGA-friendly education. He's created his own police force through ICE at DHS, and that is being bulked up by $100 billion in the big, beautiful bill. And after yesterday's extraordinary display in front of 800 generals, admirals, and NCOs, the impression that one is left with is that he's also trying to magarize, if that's a word, the U.S. military, and he more or less gave them, it's my way or the highway. He said, you, you can you can applaud or you can walk out, and if you walk out, that's the end of your career. So, do you see this as a part of Trump literally taking over all of the American institutions and tools of government?
Well, I found this even more alarming than what he's been doing with the military. For example, I've covered pretty closely the National Guard deployments to all these major American cities, from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. They tried to do Chicago, and now they're doing Portland. And what makes this more concerning, I thought, is that these joint terrorism task forces can be deployed without the support of the state governor, because most, if not all, of the states have already signed memoranda of agreement with the federal government on these JTTFs. And in addition to that, unlike the military, which is bound and limited by posse comitatus, which restricts the military from acting, from carrying out law enforcement functions on American soil, that of course was a bit of a sticking point during the colonial times, and one of the major reasons for the revolution and the birth of this country in the first place. Unlike the military, there is no such posse comitatus for the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, since they are by definition crime-fighting law enforcement entity. So they can it'll go far. It could go farther than what we've seen with the National Guard, when in DC you see them milling around, picking up trash, or just kind of standing there looking kind of like the British soldiers when you go as a tourist to London or something, just standing in front of the embassy or whatever. Like this is not going to be, this doesn't have to be theater like as with the military. And there also isn't a culture that exists within the military. If you talk to anyone down from NCOs and enlistees up to the senior officer corps, there is a longstanding culture of like, we are not supposed to interfere in domestic American affairs, and they're pretty good about that. I wouldn't say the same is necessarily true of local law enforcement, certainly the FBI. And so a lot of the constraints that have prevented the military from doing, more of what Trump wants, just doesn't exist in the case of these JTTFs and local law enforcement. So I think it'll look a lot more like the example you just pointed to, the deployment of ICE, who really can go and do these things and are not restrained, first of all, by cultural prohibition, and second of all, by actual policy from directly, engaging the American public.
But isn't Trump screening and choosing people that are sort of MAGA people? And could Hegseth, over the course of the next 3.5 years, do the same to the Pentagon? In other words, purge the sort of woke officers, and that's a pretty broad definition according to him, and bring in sort of MAGA-friendly officers? Is it possible that they could really reshape the Pentagon?
Yeah, and they'll try, but that'll be a longer-term effort. Certainly, he's replaced, for example, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He removed C.Q. Brown and replaced him with Dan Kane. And I'm sure there will be efforts towards that, but that's going to be I guess what I'm describing in the story is stuff that they can activate immediately,
right?
As opposed to this, like if you look at the right-wing think tanks, they have these generational struggles where they've been trying to shift things, and I would put the changing the character of the military more in that category. Definitely something worth worrying about, but something that's going to require more attention from Trump in the right than is the case with some of these federal law enforcement agencies.
So, Ken Klippenstein, you write in your article, Trump's NSPM 7 labels common beliefs as terrorism indicators, that the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence, directs the Justice Department, the FBI, and other national security agencies and departments to fight his version of political violence in America, retooling a network of joint terrorism task forces to focus on leftist political violence in America. This vast counterterrorism army made up of federal, state, and local agents would, as Trump aide Stephen Miller said, form the central hub of this effort. So that describes the importance of this new effort because they've already got the groundwork laid. And it's being obviously run or directed. This memorandum seems to have the fingerprints of Stephen Miller all over it. And he's, in effect, the shadow president. Some people say he's really more the president because Trump spends most of his day watching television. So, so you have a kind of combination there, don't you, of the brains, if you will, of Stephen Miller and the brawn of Corey Lewandowski, who's really running the Department of Homeland Security. A pretty frightening combo.
Yeah, when I talked to senior Homeland Security officials, as was described to me, Christine Noe might on paper be the director, but the person who's effectively in control is Stephen Miller. And it's understood in the halls of the executive suites of the Department of Homeland Security that that's the case and that's effectively their boss. And if you look at the language he uses, he's very frank about a lot of this stuff. Like, I really encourage people, first of all, to go and actually read the memorandum. It's publicly available on the White House website. It's only about 2 or 3 pages long. Like, I'm hardly interpreting anything here. Like, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about is right there in the document. And I think it sounds so crazy. I'm almost nervous that I'm going to sound hyperbolic, but that's really just the substance of the document. And to the extent that, you can find analysis on it because there's been so little. Stephen Miller's been pretty candid about it. I'll just read you one quote. He says, "This was at the Oval Office right as Trump signed the memorandum." He says, "Quote: This is the first time in American history that there is an all-of-government effort to dismantle left-wing terrorism." And what's interesting about that is throughout the document they do say radicalism, but again, that's not how how these law firms are advising their clients. They're saying, hey, progressive organizations, liberal organizations, mainstream Democrat organizations, this means you. So while they kind of hide behind this idea that, oh, it's just about violence, it's just about these radical, really far groups. First of all, those are kind of qualitative terms. What does it mean? We know how they interpret that. You know, how Trump sees radical left. You mentioned George Soros. So it's a much more mainstream groups than one might think. But what's more is when you're trying to head off this supposed terrorism, just to give listeners a sense of what that would look like. How do you fight terrorism? Well, you look at how we fought after 9/11, like how we recruited informants in mosques, how you have undercover officers posing, undercover law enforcement posing as maybe someone pretending to sell someone explosive material or something. You do a lot of stuff that is more aggressive in nature than you would do in ordinary law enforcement. And when you see, one can imagine that being applied to political protests, to advocacy, and it's a lot of pretty alarming possibilities here.
Well, they're trying to defund the opposition. I mean, we are in an era now where it's no longer, I respectfully disagree with my learned colleague on the other side. The Democrats still seem to think that they're in a debate with the Republicans when the Republicans, or the MAGA Republicans, just want to destroy them. They want to crush them. And they're going after Act Blue, the funding mechanism for the Democrats. So it's just an extension of that, isn't it? If they go after all the NGOs and nonprofits and use the IRS to defund 501c3s or take away their tax exemption.
Yeah,
They've got the tools, haven't they? I mean,
yeah, that's part of what's so shocking about this to me. That how quiet Congress has been on this, because a lot of these advocacy organizations do, favor the Democratic Party and share certain interests. So, I wrote a story on how little Congress has addressed this. To my knowledge, there's been 2 members of Congress that have said anything about this at all. And I'm sure part of that is the shutdown, and I'm sure they're busy with other things. But this is a major, it's important not to just write this off as another one of the 200 executive orders Trump has done. This is a national security presidential memorandum, of which there's only been 7, and the previous one was classified. This is in a completely different category than the executive orders. And I hope that members of Congress realize that. Someone asked Senator from Michigan, Democratic Senator Alyssa Slotkin, yesterday, I think Courthouse News asked her about the memorandum, and she said, "Oh, I haven't seen it." And she sits on the Homeland Security Committee. She sits on the Homeland Security Committee. She is always talking about how she served in the CIA and she has all this national security experience, so she understands national security. She has a weekly video show called the Intel Briefing or something like that. So it's like even the people that are supposed to be paying attention to this clearly have no idea what's going on.
Right. Well, just in closing, a lot of pundits are sort of suggesting that Trump is losing it. And if you watched his latest speeches, and particularly the one yesterday before the admirals and generals, he's all over the place. So there's a lot of speculation about Trump losing it and the portent of President J.D. Vance, but not enough focus, it would seem, on, in many ways, the real president, the guy that's hands-on, Stephen Miller, the shadow president. And as you point out, the stuff that he says is beyond belief. The rant that he gave after Charlie Kirk's assassination, he basically says that the entire Democratic Party, which is essentially half of the country, are a bunch of terrorists. And his language, and when they toured the Union Station in Washington, D.C. recently, he dismissed the protesters as a bunch of communists. So everybody's a communist. I mean, is this guy doesn't represent any kind of mainstream belief system in this country. He is, by all fair and reasonable definitions, an extremist.
Yeah, you raise an important point. When you have a weak president, as I think it's pretty clear we do, it's someone who's in his 70s. And if, as you said, you watched his speech at Quantico, he seems to be slowing down quite a bit, like our previous president, who was also in his 70s. When you have a weak president, what ends up happening is you have very strong and empowered aides. And so you can look at the people in the White House and you'll see that whatever you think of Trump, their views are even more extreme. You have people not just like Stephen Miller, but let's take, say, Trump's senior director for counterterrorism, basically the guy in charge of the whole counterterrorism portfolio and would play a role in all the stuff we've been talking about, Sebastian Gorka. His language is just as extreme as Miller's. I'll just give you one quote. He says here, and this was maybe an hour or two after the signing of the memorandum, he did an interview and he's talking about it. He says, quote, "The real problem is this: since Charlie Kirk was murdered, a friend of mine assassinated, nothing's changed on their side." He's referring to the Democratic Party. He goes on to say, quote, "Not one leader, not one left-wing thought leader, member of Congress, senator, nobody has said we distance ourselves from the violent rhetoric." That, of course, is not true, but he continues to say, quote, "The left refuses to rid themselves of the justification for violence, and as such, President Trump is taking measures to protect us from the violent rhetoric that becomes snipers and bullets." So there's the head of counterterrorism saying that rhetoric is essentially the same as violence.
Right. And the truth of the matter is that this young man, that's the assassin, according to the Republican governor of Utah, he was not motivated by politics. He was motivated by the fact that his lover, his partner, is transitioning, and he was upset with Charlie Kirk's anti-trans rhetoric. So they're making, I mean, this is what the Nazis did with Horst Wessel. They're making martyrs for a cause and trying to label everybody on the left, and not that the left is very strong in this country, it never has been, as terrorists. It's just mind-boggling what's happening.
Yeah, it's almost minutes after any shooting now. You have administration officials coming out saying, here's the violent left, before we've even seen anything. It's really crazy.
Right, and the anti-Mormon guy that just shot up at a Mormon church in Michigan, the White House press secretary said this is another example of anti-Christian terrorism.
Yep. Echoing the language of the memorandum.
Right. Well, we could go on here, Ken, but I hope people in this country realize the grave nature of the moment we're at. And I thank you for your contribution to waking people up.
Thanks, Ian. It's great being with you.
And again, I've been speaking with Ken Klippenstein, who is an independent journalist covering national security and U.S. politics, who worked at The Intercept. And prior to joining The Intercept, Klippenstein was the D.C. correspondent at The Nation and previously was a senior investigative reporter for the online news program The Young Turks. He now publishes the popular Substack at kenklippenstein.com, where he has a recent article, "Trump's NSPM 7 labels common beliefs as terrorism indicators." And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
By 9:30. Who'll ever know how much she loved them so? That dark night alone in America. A quiet voice singing something to me. An angel song about the home of the brave in this land here of the free. One time, one night in America. One more